It's time for justice.
I think the biggest difference between racism in America and racism in South Africa is I find that South African racism is and was a lot more blatant. So there's more of an acknowledgement of it as an idea. And I always say to people, I know it's strange to say this, but I often think that was the greatest gift the apartheid government gave us, is that it was there, it was happening to you, it wasn't hidden. But then what happened in America is, you hit that period where they started changing things. I don't know if it was around Nixon, and they were like, oh, we've got to be silent about this. And then it wasn't blatant anymore. Now, people have to be like detectives of their own racism. They have to figure it out. So let me give you an example. In South Africa, the government would just say, blacks cannot live in these areas. Now, I'm black, I don't live here. I don't like it, but I don't live here. You get what I'm saying? But then in America, you'd be like, can I get a home loan? And they'd be like, no. And you'd be like, why? And they'd be like, no. And you'd be like, why can't I? And then you just start realizing, you're like, wow, how come the black people all seem to only be able to get houses in these areas, but not in these areas? And these school districts are better. How come the money is going here? And you get what I'm saying? And I know it sounds strange to say, but I think there's something liberating about fighting an obvious enemy as opposed to one that you have to prove exists. That's probably the biggest difference between America and, yeah.
Why are black folks in the U.S. so much poorer on average than the rest of the country? In very simple terms, it's because of the racial wealth gap. The disparities in wealth accumulation between the rich and the poor in the U.S. become even more extreme when you take race into account. The net worth of a typical white family in the U.S. is nearly 10 times what the net worth of a typical black family is in the U.S. But why is that? From the very founding of this country, the systems of government, corporate enterprise, and societal structures were designed to lock black people out of any opportunities to accumulate wealth or pursue education as other groups did. We've only begun to acknowledge and address these disparities in the last 50 years or so, and we've still got a long way to go to right the wrongs of the past. After 240 years of slavery, where it was illegal for black people to be educated, you had another 60 years of legal segregation with Jim Crow laws, which I talked about in an earlier series. And it wasn't that long ago. Both my parents were born into the Jim Crow era. In the next video, I'm going to talk about banking and housing discrimination, which greatly affects generational wealth. Why haven't black folks in the U.S. been able to accumulate wealth at the rate that other groups have? Through much of the 20th century, black folks who attempted to purchase a home were systematically denied bank loans through a practice called redlining. Redlining started in the 1930s in the U.S. Bank lenders would color code neighborhoods according to their perceived risk. Poorer areas that were predominantly black or Latino were colored red, meaning banks would not lend to anyone in those neighborhoods. The federal government's Homeowners Loan Corporation created these maps along with real estate agents and banks. This practice went on until 1968, until it was technically outlawed by the Fair Housing Act. The Community Reinvestment Act in 1977 helped too, but there are many indications that housing discrimination is alive and well today. It's estimated that many black families have lost out on $212,000 in increased property values over the last 40 years because their home is in a formerly redlined area. In part 3, I'll talk about how federal housing segregation policies legally prevented black people from buying homes in the suburbs. Why is the inner city filled with so many black people as white folks flock to the suburbs? Generational wealth building is directly tied to home ownership. For decades, black people were largely shut out of that system. In the 1930s, under Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, the newly created Federal Housing Authority gave money to builders who mass-produced homes in the suburbs. The federal government stipulated that none of those homes could be sold to black buyers. This was federal policy. So for white folks, you had subsidized housing in the suburbs. For black folks, you had subsidized housing projects in the inner city. Home ownership in white families increased exponentially after World War II through the GI Bill. Many black vets were systematically shut out of that process too. You can see how this sets up a feedback loop. If your parents and grandparents weren't able to accumulate any wealth through home ownership, not only do they have nothing to pass down to you, but you're more likely to deplete your resources by taking care of them in their old age. And you're less likely to have any accumulated wealth to pass down to your children. In 2021, only 44% of black families are homeowners versus 73% of white families.
We've left untouched the biggest segregation of all, that overwhelms everything else and hangs over our entire society, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. There are clearly defined areas in every one that I've lived in that are all white or mostly white, or all African American and mostly African American. And all of us accept this as part of the natural environment. It's not we think it's a good thing. We say it's too bad, but we think it's sort of natural, normal, something we accept. It's not that we've tried to do anything about it and have failed. We've never even tried. And so in order to rationalize to ourselves our failure to undo it, we've adopted a national myth. And that myth is pervasive. It's pervasive across the political spectrum. The liberals and conservatives hold it. The blacks and whites hold it. The name of that myth is we have de facto segregation. Not something that was created by government like all the other segregations that we undid in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but this is something that sort of just happened by accident. It happened because people like to live with each other of the same race. Or it happened because private actors, whether they were real estate agents or bankers or private citizens, discriminated in how they sold or rented homes. Or it happened because African Americans happen to be poorer than whites on average, and therefore they can't afford to move to middle-class communities. De facto segregation is an utter myth. There is no basis to it whatsoever. The racial segregation in every metropolitan area in this country was created by racially explicit government policy designed to create racial boundaries, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another, with policies that are so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape that we see in cities all over the country. Just like we have the myth of de facto segregation, we also think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live, where lots of mothers with children, single parents with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, acting out, engaging in oppositional behavior that attracts attention to the police and a cycle of violence that we've seen in so many places. That's what we think of as public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for middle-class, working-class families. During the Depression, poor people were not permitted into public housing when public housing was first created. There was a housing shortage, and public housing was created for people who could afford to pay the full rent in housing, and they did in public housing, but for whom there was no housing available. Everywhere, the Public Works Administration and the other federal agencies that succeeded it created segregated public housing, separate projects for African Americans and whites in cities all across the country, frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated, that were integrated. During World War II, the actions of the government intensified to create segregation. They intensified because throughout the country, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production, of war production, to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. And the migration of workers into centers of defense production overwhelmed frequently the communities where they were working. The federal government had to build housing for these workers if they wanted the ships to be produced. For the African Americans, they built the housing on temporary housing because the explicit goal of the housing was that African Americans after World War II would leave and go back to the South. So they built temporary housing for the African Americans along the railroad tracks and near the shipyards. And they built more stable housing for the white migrants in the white residential areas. Very soon after that, now in the mid-1950s, a development occurred everywhere in the country, which was systematic, similar, and widespread. And that was that suddenly all the white projects began to develop large numbers of vacancies. All the black projects began to develop long waiting lists. And soon the situation became so untenable, so conspicuous. You couldn't have projects in the same city, some of which were virtually empty, and the other of which had long waiting lists. The federal government and local housing agencies opened up all projects to African Americans. And then at about the same time, industry left the cities. Fewer and fewer jobs became available to the now increasingly and soon almost all African American population in the public housing. The population could no longer afford to pay the full cost of its rent, so the government had to begin subsidizing public housing. Maintenance declined in the projects. Prior to this, maintenance workers lived in the projects. They were paid good salaries and lived in the projects. Upkeep declined. The projects became vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing today. Another federal program that was perhaps even more powerful in creating racial segregation, and that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration designed to move white families out of urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. At a racially explicit basis, we created a white noose around every urban area with federally subsidized single-family home subdivisions. These were giant subdivisions in many cases. The most famous of them, I'm sure you've heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to build 17,000 homes or 15,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers? We were in a suburban country at that time. People thought the whole idea was lunacy. Who's going to want to live in a single-family home when they can live in the city instead? Any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families over the next couple of generations gained, you can do the arithmetic, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity. They used that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation. Of course, it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well-spoken.
just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day.
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day
So pretty. Can
Can I touch
your
it,
hair?
please? Can I please?
is fucking annoying and makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares? Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try less challenging, Major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
You know what we don't talk about enough? The literal PTSD that black folks have from living in a white America. The reality that white supremacy is around all of us, and thus it determines how we move in our everyday life. Because we're all aware of how white people respond through microaggressions when they're uncomfortable. For instance, moving to the other side of the street because you feel like you might get robbed, or locking your door when a black person walks past your car. Well, today I needed to buy groceries, and I actually ordered pickup instead of going in the store. And the entire time I was sitting in the parking lot, I was absolutely looking around to see what was happening. Why? Because someone yesterday decided to murder and massacre black folks at a grocery store. Ask me the last time I've been to a movie theater, and the 2 times I did go to the movies, I sat near the exit, because should a white supremacist decide they want to show their ugly head today, I need to have an escape plan. I can't even remember the last time I've been to church, and the thought of someone coming in and shooting up the place didn't cross my mind. And you know why? Being black in a white America is having to be ever present and ever aware that historically, white people have been given an entitlement that allows them to mistake inconvenience for oppression. It is literally just realizing that you could be the wrong place at the wrong time with the right white person who has enough hate in their heart to say that you have the wrong skin color, and they decide to take your life. That is the PTSD I'm talking about.
Okay, I'm just trying to make sure that this doesn't go left. That's what I'm making sure.
What are you gonna do? What?
What is your problem? I didn't do anything to you. I would be better if somebody watches because he's getting aggressive with me and I'm scared.
You're aggressive and scared. Okay, I'm standing over here.
You're quiet now, but you were just screaming at me for no reason. I don't care. I don't care. You get to talk to me and you gotta wake up, you got a badge. I don't care. He pulled out his firearm and he got mad because I told him to put it away.
Firearm because the male who was driving the car was concealing his right hand from our view.
The whole time I told them 4 times there's no weapons in this car and there's no text on this car. There's nothing to be. I told, bro, can you pull over, please? I just want to make sure I make it home alive, you know, to my parents.
Yeah, you know, you should really get an Oscar for the acting job that you're putting on right now.
Acting?
Relax.
You should know what's going on. It's your people.
Exactly what's going on.
Sir, stop talking to me like that.
And false statements.
I'm not making false statements. I'm saying my point of view.
Relax and sit tight.
Leave me alone. Don't talk to me. You guys, yesterday I literally seen 4 white officers attack a black dude, and I literally posted it on TikTok. This is what you go through for being black, because we weren't wearing seatbelts. But you have a firearm out because we weren't wearing seatbelts. And he's been screaming at me the whole time, so I just hope you guys know that. A firearm, he had a gun in my face, a gun in my face. I don't want to stop recording, but I need to call my mom. I don't have another. That's sad that these people think that because they have badges, they can talk to us any kind of way. I have freedom of speech. I have my rights.
Mama, do me a favor. Step out of the car real quick. You keep your camera on. That's fine.
That man's not coming near me, right? The one that was screaming at me, he can't come near me. I swear.
Step out of the car. You don't have anything on you, right?
No, I just came from work. Okay. I swear he comes up to the car with his gun in my face. You know how you approach a car? Put your hand on your weapon, not in somebody's face. And then he's screaming at me the whole time. I got it on recording, so I want his badge number and his name.
All right, 7909, that's Sergeant Baskins. I'm 9305, Officer Rivera, which I'm the arresting officer, okay?
And 5657 cell.
You can take the car?
Okay, hold on. He is not resisting, and he is
calm down.
steady pulling my husband. He is pulling my husband. This is unlawful force. This is unlawful force. This is unlawful force. This is unlawful force. You need to calm down. Ma'am, I'm trying to figure out where we are. I don't know what my latitude and longitude is. I don't know where we are. It says I'm by Georgia State 401. I have no clue. I'm going to put you on speaker. Then you can talk to this officer. My kids are in the car and I'm recording this. He is pulling my husband out of the car. He is pulling my husband out of the car. I am getting out of the car, officer. I am getting out of the car, officer. I am getting out of the car. You will not do anything.
Let him get back.
No, I will not. He is not resisting.
Just
He
sit on
is
the
not
ground.
resisting.
Get back.
Help! Help!
Get out of the road.
Help!
Get over your belly.
Help! 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 This man is taking my husband! Help! 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 Help!
Get out of the road.
No, I will not! He is doing something to my husband! No, I will not! Help! I will not get out of the road! Yes! Call the police! Call the police! Call the police! No! You are fucked up, motherfucker! Call the police! We have kids in the car! He is trying to kill my husband for no reason!
Get over here.
No!
Get over here.
Do not put your hands on me. I have not done anything wrong. I have not done anything wrong.
You are under
I
arrest
have
now.
not done anything wrong. I have not done anything wrong.
Now you are under
I
arrest
am
as well.
not. There's no reason for you to. There's no reason. No, motherfucker. Did you just.
You're not about to arrest my wife for nothing.
Slam me back on the ground.
Get on the ground.
No.
Get on the ground.
No. It's something else.
Put your hands behind your back. Sir, we need help.
You need help, sir? Does he need help? He's hurt my wife. He's hurting my wife for asking for help.
Yes, sir.
Stand up. Wait a minute.
Put your hands behind your back.
I am a cop.
Put your hands behind your back.
I can't, fool. I can't. I can't.
Behind your back. Stop resisting.
I can't. You tased me. He tased me. How the fuck am I supposed to move? Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God.
She was doing nothing.
What was I doing? I was asking for help because he's arresting my husband. No.
Get up.
No, I can't get up to tase me.
You got to drive, Tage. You're fine. Come on, get up.
I cannot get up. My legs are not movable. What are you doing? I cannot get up. You tased me. What is wrong with you?
A few days ago in Akron, Ohio, police stopped 25-year-old Jayland Walker for a broken taillight. Jayland fled the scene during the traffic stop and got out of the car and started running away from the police. Recently released body cam footage shows that he did not in fact shoot at the police and he did not reach for a gun in his waistband. But the police shot him over 60 times and then handcuffed his lifeless body behind his back. Jayland's crime was having a broken taillight. The punishment for running from the police is not death. Just a few minutes ago, police pulled over Robert Crimo, a person of interest in the shooting that took place in Highland Park this morning. He was stopped by a traffic cop, led the cop on a short chase, and was arrested without incident. This guy, who was accused of being armed and dangerous, who was named as a person of interest at a mass shooting this morning, pulled over by police, led them on a chase, arrested without incident.
I keep getting white people telling me that I'm racist against whites, and I get so confused because you can't be racist to white people. Not only do I not have the social power in order to enact racism on a systemic level, but when we're talking about white people and white supremacy and white privilege, we're talking about white people as an entity. as a player and actor within white supremacy and those who benefit from white privilege. We're not talking about it on a personal, individual level in their personhood necessarily. And I know what you're thinking, dang, that's really dehumanizing. You're not looking at white people as just like humans and looking at them individually. Well, no, not in this context. But it wasn't me who dehumanized white people. And it wasn't other black people, and it wasn't other people of color. It was white colonizers who dehumanized white people. And don't just take my word for it, because I know y'all love to get mad at my word. So let's take the words of Aimé Césaire and his discourse on colonialism, where he's talking about how the colonizer decivilized himself, and that through these barbaric acts of colonizing and raping and pillaging, a gangrene set in, and this poison of savagery infiltrated their very being. And don't just take our word for it. Let's take the words of Jean-Paul Sartre or Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, where, there he's begging the question, who are the true savages? Who are the true actors of barbarism? And don't just take our word for it. Take the words of Dr. Joy DeGruy and her discussing post-traumatic slave syndrome, and how she talks about all these barbaric acts of colonizing and slavery removed white people's ability to feel empathy for black people. That they're looking at us and can't acknowledge the fact that we literally feel pain as a sentient being. And don't just take our word for it. Take the words of Karen and Barbara Fields, and how they talk about racism has become so tangible due to rituals that aren't based in anything true, that we now exist in this racecraft, this illusion of racecraft. And that white people don't see themselves as the aggressors of racism. They barely see themselves as a passive actor within racism. So that's why they'll say, oh, that man got shot because he's black, instead of that man got shot because a racist shot him. Y'all all call that racism against white people, when really it's just history. It's critical race theory. That's the shit that you're afraid of your kids hearing. So no, you can't be racist to white people. And it's not us who dehumanized y'all. Y'all ancestors did. And it sounds like that's something you should probably take up with y'all ancestors.
It's time for justice.